Sure.
say hi, gather.
And I don't really know how many people to expect. I think that in my experience with doing just a couple of these so far, we'll have a lot of people showing up without video.
Yeah. Seems right.
So, well, I see Carol Ross. You're not going to show us your face, Carol?
No pressure.
Right. Listen, we're all doing these new normals, right? So everybody's all of a sudden conscious of what's behind them and in their
I
background.
know.
I actually saw a really cool somebody. I was doing a webinar on webinars, and they make a green screen that fits on the back of your chair.
Oh, cool.
Like it literally attaches to your chair. It's big enough so it blocks out anything behind you, and you put anything on it you want.
Nice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Leslie Geller. Did you guys get the questions that I sent earlier today?
Yes, thank you so much for sending them.
Okay, sure, good.
And Leslie, I also have them up on my screen.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, perfect.
Here.
You see somebody's head.
Oh, there. Okay. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi, Claudia. How are you?
Good. Hi, Betsy.
Hi, Claudia.
Belated happy anniversary.
Thank you very much.
And bon appetit.
Yes, dinner time. Shepherd's pie.
Nice.
Flour cooking.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see the numbers of people. We had we tried to do our monthly meeting on Zoom, and we did it, but we only had 5-6 people show up.
We were there. We were.
Yeah, you were. You absolutely were. And then on the flip side, I did something that
There were more than 5 or 6.
Were there?
Yes.
Okay. I don't remember. It seemed small. Hi, Carol. Now we can see Carol.
God, Leslie.
It's funny how many platforms there are. I've been on meetings just today on Zoom, Skype, and Blue Jeans, and I've recently done WebEx, and there's another one I'm forgetting because I wasn't familiar with it at all. It's just there's
Blue
so
Jeans.
many platforms. Yeah,
Never
they
heard
use
of
it
that.
at Easttown Regional Council for some reason.
Oh, that's great. Hi, Dave. I haven't seen you in a while. That's great. So,
We're just
Claudia,
giving
should we give it
people
to just like about 7:05?
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, a few more minutes.
So, and this is good. I mean, from an ECA perspective, we have our kind of what do you call the normal players, like our regular group, the usual suspects. That's what I was trying to think.
Yep. You know what? We formed the Lake Hills Neighborhood Association with a group of about 4 or 5 of us to start out with about 15 years ago or so. And we didn't know what the hell we were doing at the time, but we knew that we needed a bigger voice in the community. And so we just got and people met each other serendipitously, and it grew from there. And then, but there were always 4 or 5 people who ran the whole thing, always. And lately it's been one person who runs the whole thing. And I don't know what we would do without Mindy. She makes it all go. I mean, she's got lots of great volunteers, but she keeps it all together. So it's been a great experience, actually.
It's been impressive, actually, to watch. And honestly, we emulate a lot of what we see coming from Lake Hills just because I think it's so close and really well organized.
Yeah, I take no credit. I was on the leadership for the first 4 or 5 years, but now I'm just a hanger on. Just show up at the picnics and the meetings and things. Yeah. We had great help from the city, Carol.
Yeah, they went through a rebirth about the time
Good.
that I started with the city.
Right.
So yeah, we've been very impressed. And then they had that student study of the housing in Lake Hills that was really cool.
That was awesome. It really
Yeah.
was.
Mm-hmm.
And we learned from College Hill. I think it's a pay it forward sort of thing. I mean, the College Hill folks were very organized and they did a really good job, and we wanted to be like them.
There's actually an impressive number of well-organized neighborhood associations, you know, in and around Bellevue. So I think it's been nice for us being so new, because we've had a lot of models to kind of follow.
Yeah.
So it's 7:05, and I think that I like respecting people's time. So thank you everybody for being here who is here. And the group is small enough. I think that if we wind up with another 10, 15 people, we might go to just kind of questions via the chat box. I am going to monitor the chat box. And so if anybody would like to post a question, please feel free to do so. And I will, you know, kind of capture it, put it to the side, and we'll probably take, I don't know, however much time we can at the end to try to go back and address any questions that Claudia either hadn't gotten to or people didn't feel were addressed. So Claudia, thank you again so much for making the time to do this.
You bet. Thanks everyone. It's great to be with you in this way. And so I thought I would start out with just a few minutes of introductory comments. And I've got 4 topics. The first is just general information about what's going on with the epidemic from public health, King County. A little bit about what the county's responses are for number 2. Number 3, I just like to share kind of some of my thoughts and priorities going forward. And then I think we can preserve the bulk of the discussion for the sites, the response sites. They call them IQR sites, or in, what is it again? Isolation, quarantine, and recovery sites, because I know that's the issue that came up most in the questions that I received in advance. So I'll just do it that way, and we'll see where people want to go from there. But the first thing I have is just a few informational slides. And here they come. Hope you can see them. Nope, that's the wrong one. I wanted to.
So can people see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted to do it in slideshow format. There we go. So this, they each have a point, and it's mainly that there's a lot of information that you have available to you on a regular basis, and I wanted to share what it is and where it is. This is just a screenshot from the King County Public Health Database dashboard, and you can see the link in the lower right-hand corner. What I tend to do is end up emailing the links at the end, which I will do again here, or I can put them in the chat. But so this data is now 1 day old. Today we actually had 9 more deaths, and I believe it was 77 more cases. So these numbers in the upper left here are showing the flattening of the curve. The number of cases, the number of deaths had been quite a bit higher each day than they are now, but they obviously are still continuing. They're just continuing at a lower level. The cumulative counts by test result date runs, that's just the line, and you can see how it grows over time. They used to report negative results, but we rely on data from the state, and the state stopped reporting negative test results, so we don't know how many positives out of how many tests. So we don't have the denominator, which means we don't fully understand the death rates. Like, so these numbers down here are not, we know they're not correct. They're the best that not that they're not correct, they're correct, but we don't know if they are weighted correctly. So for example, you see the death rate per 100,000 people over the age of 80 is really tremendously higher than the other rates of, so this is if people get infected, get test positive, and then how many of them pass away. per 100,000 residents in the area. We know that this is weighted because we are testing, our testing is directed at older people. That's how you qualify to get a test. So I wouldn't weigh too heavily on these actual rates, but it does show you things like male, female, and then up over here, you can click on a map that shows you positive test results by area. There was a request, and it's on my notes, I'll refer to it later. There was a question about, by the way, dinner's arriving back behind me, so say hi, folks.
Hopefully there's enough for everybody.
Yeah. I have a number for Bellevue, but you can see that it breaks down by, I believe that's census tract actually. And no, that's probably zip code, isn't it? Nope,
That's going to be zip code because it's more than just.
Yeah. Okay, so I didn't want to go over all the data just to show you a little bit about where we are, but the fact is that you can access this data anytime you want online. Let's see, I'll have it there. Next slide. This chart comes from an article that was published in National Geographic in March, and it covers 3 different academic studies that were done separately, but combined in this article of what happened with the epidemic curves in 1918, 100 years ago, in various cities. And why I like to show this is the line represents a normalized curve of deaths, weekly deaths per 100,000 in each area. The shading represents when in time there was social distancing measures occurring. And then the grayed out number is the deaths per 100,000 after 24 weeks of the pandemic. So you can see there were some of these places had these big spikes, but many of them had 2, a lump and then a second lump. And here's Seattle, we had a lump and then a second lump. And the second lump comes after you open up the social distancing. So that is when people talk about a rebound or a second wave, that's what they're talking about. And that's why even though the numbers start to look better, we have to remain very cautious or else we can see a lot more deaths and infections continue. All right.
It's also interesting, just as a note, that Seattle continued even then the social distancing measures in that second
They
period.
did, because they didn't want to see a third wave. Probably. I mean, I'm speculating, but that would be my guess, right? And you see Columbus, Ohio had a second wave, even though they never broke there. I mean, it's fascinating information. I don't know that these are cities that ordered social distancing much sooner and longer periods, but it's available. And I also have the link to this article if anybody wants to dive deeper into what they were looking at. Okay, so although the big question that I get most of all these days is when are we going to start releasing some of the restrictions and let people get back to regular life? At least, I mean, I think everybody gets that this isn't going to be a light switch, as the governor likes to say. It's not going to flick back on. Suddenly it's going to be a dialer. We dialed down and we will dial back up. But what needs to happen? And the public health community at every level is starting to coalesce around these 5 standards for when we will feel safer to start to scale back up. We've heard these from the CDC, from the state health department and the governor, and from public health, and they want to see a steady decrease in the number of new cases for at least 2 weeks. They want to have measures of healthcare system readiness so that if there is a second wave, we're ready for people to come into the hospitals and they're prepared. Testing, and by the way, this is the big barrier still, in that we will need to be able to have rapid testing and reporting for anyone who we believe is or may be infected. And then they'll need public health readiness, which is the capacity and the staffing to do contact tracing and go back to the point where we're actually containing outbreaks. If somebody gets sick in an institution, we talk to all their contacts and isolate everyone who might be sick rather than isolating the whole population, which is what happens when contact tracing fails. And ultimately the full release of all restrictions, like when we might start to see, I don't know, stadiums full of people again, may depend on when we have treatment and ultimately vaccinations. So these are what we're hearing this week from healthcare professionals, public health professionals, about how we come out of this. And then just finally, King County Council launched a website. We were getting a lot of people contacting us about what can I do? I want to help. I'm fine. I'm doing well. I want to help people. And I will follow up with the website. We're trying to compile every source of opportunities to help, donations, volunteering, etc., and put them all in one place. So if people really feel like they want to do something to help out, they can go and look here. So that's really all I had in terms of slides. I want to talk real briefly about what we're doing in response at the King County Council. So real quickly, so since the beginning of the epidemic, we've spent, and these dollars are a couple weeks old now, so they're low, but we've spent at least $17 million above our normal public health budget on response. We've put $50 million into the IQR sites, which we're going to talk about. We managed to reallocate some funding from a source that is for early education that's almost kind of a windfall source for us to help provide free childcare for healthcare professionals and essential workers. We delayed the property tax deadline from April to June 1 and waived all fees. We contributed $1.5 million to the United Way fund, along with Seattle Foundation in Seattle. They had $5 million for rental assistance for people who weren't going to be able to pay their rents. I think you all may know, even though the governor has ordered no evictions, that doesn't mean that rent isn't piling up. And a lot of people who can't afford to pay rent, as soon as the eviction moratorium ends, they'll end up with a 14-day notice because they haven't been able to pay. And I talked about the project care opportunities for community response. We're continuing to look at other ways we can help. We have got an interesting funding source through the lodging tax, which, believe it or not, we still have some lodging tax capacity, even though hotels are largely empty. And we're looking at a reallocation of some of that money for uses that the state limits what we can use it for. We can use it for tourism, for cultural arts, and for housing, and just a little bit of homelessness response. I have a proposal in there that will come forward to help support the youth homelessness organizations on the east side. That's Friends of Youth, because they are really struggling. We have a proposal from one of the council members that you will be reading about probably in the news in the next few days to adopt the motion that calls for a rent and mortgage moratorium. I will tell you all that I am struggling with that one, because I do think that people need to keep a roof overhead and that we need to do what we can to help them. But this seems to me to be fictional. It's completely against the US Constitution for us to do this. And if we did it, I don't know that it would actually help anybody. So we're going to be talking about that. That debate is to come. There's a lot of other measures that we will be discussing, but we're really not a major funder. Our Health and Human Services funding is dedicated and it's very much in use. As I said before, we've already spent $17 million over our budget for public health. Our revenues are down. Our expenses are way up in certain parts of the county. And although we expect federal CARES Act funding to help cover our expenses, we don't think it'll cover everything that we need to do, and it certainly won't cover all our revenue loss. I want to hold off on talking about my priorities for now. I think we should switch to, let me just stop and ask questions, and then we can talk about answer questions about that part, and then we can switch to talking about the siting, which I think is what people most want to talk about.
And actually, I would tell you, the details and the things that you just covered are great and helpful. And I think that this is where there is a lot of public information. All the questions that we're getting really are related to the Eastgate site.
Right. Okay. I don't know if anybody else wants to ask anything about general stuff. Okay, so let's go into talking about the sites. I'm going to pull up my notes again.
And actually, Claudia, just as another to help you prioritize the answers, the siting is a major one, but there's also a lot of questions coming in about the testing. You mentioned it earlier on. I actually heard a number. There was a NYU economist who was saying that, and this is nationally, that for us to be back to a place where we can reasonably be checking everybody in the way it needs to happen, we're going to need to be at the capacity to do 20 to 30 million tests a day
Yeah, nationwide, yes.
nationwide.
And we currently have, last number I heard was capacity for about 3,000 tests here in the region. It's not nearly enough, but
A day?
a day. So it's not bad. It's a lot more than when we last talked. It has come up quite a bit because of the private testing, but there's always something. So and I think might be some people who know a lot more, including Saki, about medicine than I do. But my understanding is there's 4 or so things that you need for testing. You need the personnel to do it. You need the PPE, the personal protective equipment for those personnel. You need the supplies to conduct the testing, the swabs, the vials, etc. You need the testing medium that you place the test in to preserve it. And then you need the lab capacity to process the tests. And there's always been a problem at some level in that chain. And this week, what we were hearing was there's just not enough supplies. We need more swabs, we need more Petri dishes, whatever. And they've ordered like a whole boatload of them at the state. So the state is the lead on procurement. I think that at first the challenge was the lab capacity. We now have plenty of lab capacity is what I'm told. And this is an area that I keep asking questions about. It's a little confusing and perplexing to me, even why nationally we still have this bottleneck on testing, and yet we do. It's absolutely clear that we do. And I don't know why, fully understand why, but I know that we need to keep working on that, or else we are going to be stuck in a cycle where we will have waves, or we will all be, in social distancing mode, which can't last forever. People will start to not be able to tolerate it, for economically, psychologically, all kinds of reasons. Yeah. So the testing story.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
right.
So in terms of the siting, I don't know how you want to go through it, but why don't you? Yeah, just go ahead.
Let me start general and then get specific. Generally speaking, and I'm trying to answer the questions in a logical way, but I also have them listed, and you do too, I heard.
Yeah.
So we can cover any that I don't happen to hit upon. So there's 3 different kinds of sites, basically. We say IQR, isolation, quarantine, recovery. Isolation is for people who have confirmed infections and need to be separate from those they might infect. Quarantine is for people who have been exposed or who have symptoms, but we don't know if they're sick or not yet, and we just want to keep them. So that's basically what we're all doing. We may have been exposed and we are quarantining ourselves. And recovery sites, or what we're calling assessment and recovery sites, are mainly going to be, it turns out, for people who are sick, who know that they have COVID. They don't need to be in a hospital, but they do need to be somewhere, and they don't have a place to be. The folks that we were looking at when this plan was made was people who are highly vulnerable, the elderly, and folks with underlying conditions who don't have a place to be, or who can't be in the place that they have to be because they might infect others who are highly vulnerable. We were looking at travelers who just don't have a home to go to but are here. And of course, because we have a homeless population, we were looking at people who are in homelessness or in shelters who can't be on the streets or there. We've identified at this point 4 isolation and quarantine locations. It's Kent, Aurora, Issaquah, and Top Hat, which is in White Center. 3 assessment and recovery centers, Shoreline, Eastgate, and Soto. And there's...
Is Soto what had been the Army tents? Or are there tents like what's in Eastgate and Shoreline in Soto as well?
No, I don't think that. I think it is a building, but it might be I don't know. That's a good question. We'll follow up on that one. And then there's another type of building, another type of facility that we're calling shelter de-intensification, and that's in order to allow shelters to continue running. People need to spread out. I mean, anybody, and I know some of you have been in our shelters or volunteered in there, people tend to be on mats on the floor or on bunks. They're very close together. And so to spread them out, we've opened up a building in the King County International Airport, commonly known as Boeing Field. There's going to be a hangar available for this purpose. Harbor Island, another very large industrial type building that we're going to use for this purpose. The Red Lion in Bellevue has entered into an agreement with the Sophia Way, and King County is supporting that with some funding to provide rooms for Sophia Way Women's Shelter clients. And then the Quality Inn in SeaTac has provided some beds for to be run by Catholic Community Services. And of all of those together, except for the Red Lion and Quality Inn, which are actually King County's a partner, but we're not running them, so I don't keep numbers on them. The other numbers all together, there are 71 people in these IQR sites as of today, and that's a relatively high number.
What is the
much
breakdown of where people are? So one of the things that keeps coming up, it'd be nice to know, it doesn't look like the Eastgate site is active in any way.
It is not. The Eastgate site is not open. Only 4 of these sites are open: Kent, Aurora, Issaquah, and
Shoreline.
And Shoreline is partially open. The issue with the Shoreline is the only assessment and recovery site that's open. They have got a facility capacity of 140 to 150 people, and they're currently holding only a very small number. I don't have the number, but it's in the teens, I think, mostly because of staffing. That's the challenge right now, is they don't have staffing to expand that more. We're working on providing more staffing. The other question that we get a lot is, when is Eastgate going to open? And the answer, to be quite honest with you, is we don't know. We have a promise from the executive, and we have a weekly conversation with executive staff on this topic. And they have promised that they will give us notice when they're getting ready to open. They thought they were getting ready to open a couple of times already, and it has not opened. And as long as Shoreline isn't really being used to any like capacity, I don't know when we will see Eastgate open. Let's see what else.
So then, can you? Is there a way? I know that you made a comment that the county is $17 million over budget on public health, and that an additional $50 million was put into the IQR sites. So one of the questions that keeps coming up is, well, what is going to be done with these sites? And I realize that you can't answer because we don't really know. But at the same time, here we are with these 2, very impressive tents, and as I understand it, the tents in Eastgate are identical to what is in Shoreline. And so we all have, via this Cairo thing from last week, we've got an inside look at how things are done, and so it makes sense that those are assessment and recovery sites. But if they're not needed,
right,
then what?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it reminds me a little bit of early on in this. I'm the chair of the council this year, and I made probably the biggest executive decision I'll ever get to make as the chair of the council, and I canceled all our meetings and told everybody to go home. And I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues in the hallway, and he said, "Aren't you overreacting just a little bit?" And then my answer was like slightly facetious, but like, I hope so. I hope I'm overreacting. I hope this isn't all necessary. But if you recall, the plan for these was originally 3,000 total beds among all the types of sites, IQR. And so that was a projection based on where we were on the curve, and we were heading up very sharply early on. We were seeing, cases doubling every 4 to 5 days. We were seeing the earliest trace study showed that each individual who was infected was infecting 2.7 on average additional people. And so if you sort of play that exponential number out, we were concerned that we were going to see hundreds of thousands of people who were either infected or thought they were infected. And so they ramped up very, very quickly. Now what's happened is the second set of data showed that we were doubling only every 7 to 8 days. And each individual was infecting about 1.4 additional people. So better, right? Last week, we learned that we're doubling only every 4 or 5 days. And each individual is now infecting less than on average 1 additional person. So the number of cases starts to go down. So, the hope is we don't need all these sites. We set them up in the hope that we needed them. If we overshot the target, that's great. People aren't suffering and dying on the streets, right? And I
think that we're all in agreement with you and in support of the fact that better to be safe than sorry, better to have been prepared. So, and now we're faced with, again, this is also one of those things. No, I won't say nobody. I personally wouldn't fault the government for overspending in this arena, because again, better safe than sorry. But especially in Eastgate, our history here is different. And so, the question that everybody is asking and frankly concerned about is, so we now have these massive, facilities on the site where the new shelter for CFH is supposed to be going. So what's going to happen? Are these tents just going to be dismantled? I mean, this is millions of dollars from out of King County's pocket.
So that is a great question, and I know people are rightly concerned. And by the way, one of the questions that we've seen from this group, but not just from Eastgate, from White Center and Kent and other places as well, is about the process we used to get to where we are today. Why didn't we talk to people? Why wasn't there more public involvement? Why didn't we go through the normal permitting processes with the cities, et cetera? There's a commitment by the county in each of those sites that we have opened, and that we will not continue to use the sites as they are dismantled for a purpose other than COVID response until we go through some kind of additional public process. But what I've heard is that the City of Bellevue has negotiated with the county that the tents will not stay. That's my expectation, is that the tents will not stay. So what happens to them is a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that people were worried that this would be, in Kent, this was a really huge issue. They sued the county over this, that this was a way to end run their city decision-making processes and sneak a homeless shelter into this hotel in one of their business parks, and they didn't want that. And so that's, the county has made a commitment, the county executive has made a commitment that that's not what's going to happen.
So, Claudia, is that something that is going to be published? So it's one of those things where, as you can appreciate, and I'm sure, you get caught in this, everybody's going to be watching every word you say and writing things down, So is this information that will be shared publicly, whether it's through the City of Bellevue or King County directly? Because I think that information alone would put a lot of people at ease, because a lot of the questions are really around, the siting process for these tents and what was it ultimately. If they're just taken down and the neighbors and the community knows that we're going back to the original plan in place, that answers a lot of people's questions.
Yeah, I will. I took a note myself, and I will ask the executive in the city if they'll put that out, because I've just heard it verbally that they have that agreement. What I can say as your District 6 King County Council member is that that's my understanding and expectation of the commitment. And as a representative for you all, that is something that I will advocate for if it becomes necessary. If it becomes necessary for me to stand up and say, hey, wait a second, we promised that we weren't going to keep these tents up and repurpose them because we didn't go through the kind of permitting and public process that we should have. So that's my personal commitment. And if you want, I will write it to you in an email.
I'd appreciate that. That'd be great.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah. So, a lot of the other questions are really kind of related around a lot of this. So I think, you answered questions about the permitting. So it sounds like, if I understood correctly, with the IQR sites, the normal permitting process was not followed. We're in a state of emergency, and so we're doing the best we can. So I think that makes sense. And if the tents were to be repurposed, it would have to be only after that process of whatever it is, and it's different in different places, is properly gone through channel-wise. And it sounds like before that would even happen, these tents would be dismantled, and then it would be determined whether they would be rebuilt.
That's my understanding. So let's say a hypothetical, because there's been no final decision as to what's going to happen on the Eastgate site, period, right? Like long-term about the final, it's been chosen as a site. It hasn't been closed on. So the long-term status of the Eastgate site, King County still owns it. We've signed a purchase and sale agreement, but it's not been fully executed. So the county still owns it. At some point, my hope is that we complete that, and then CFH will own it, and then they will build their future building.
Right.
Let's suppose something happens and CFH and the community and the city, and by the community I'm pointing in this direction, and the city sit down and say, you know what? we like the tents. We would like to keep the tents. I mean, we wouldn't say no to that, but you'd need to have that conversation first.
Okay.
And the truth is, I don't know if we would say no to that. I don't recall if we bought them or leased them. I'm looking at Madeline. Do we buy or lease those tents? Because here's the other thing. Emergency also means they don't come to us for the decisions they would usually come to us for. To lease something like that would often involve a council approval. But because we're in an emergency, we're not doing all the approvals we used to do. The executive has a tremendous amount of independent authority. We will get reports and ratify things after, but he can do what he needs to do in the emergency.
So that would actually also be great information to know. Whether these are leased, because one of the questions that somebody had asked is, what is the cost of keeping these tents up at the moment? And I am going to take executive privilege and kind of veer questions away from questions that I know you can't really answer or are less pertinent to the issue right now. But these are, questions that people have, and the cost to the community is high, but we're in an emergency. So,
right.
So, one of the other questions that came up, and this came up at the March 19th meeting as well, in hindsight, which we don't yet have, but I think that it would be valuable to evaluate how decisions were made, and decide and determine if these were really the right decisions to make, so that in a similar scenario moving forward, the best decisions can be made. So, for example, somebody had written, given the addiction and mental health issues prevalent in King County, how wise is it to house vulnerable people like senior citizens in the same place as a homeless population? And again, I would say that that's rhetorical, because I think it's I think nobody would question that it's not necessarily the best way to do it.
Right.
And yet these decisions were made and came up, and so it would be good, to have King County and the cities, evaluate in hindsight how if those decisions were good decisions. We know that they've cost you. So actually, can you talk a little bit about so you mentioned that you're $17 million over budget for King County Public Health to date annually.
Yeah.
But you also put $50 million into the IQR sites.
Correct.
How is that different?
There are two different funds, two different numbers. So it's 67 million together. And that was a number of a couple weeks ago that we got that number. So I expect it's higher than that. We do expect most or all of these expenses to be reimbursed by the federal government, because they've committed a whole boatload of money to supporting the COVID response itself. But that is something that also will happen at the end of the day. I see Madeline wrote to us that the tents have been purchased. Thank you for confirming that, Madeline. Madeline's in my office, by the way, if y'all haven't met Madeline. Thank you. So yeah, we're going to be well over budget on public health responses. The question is will this turn out to have been a good decision-making process, a good use of money? I agree that there's going to have to be a very big wrap-up report at the end of all of this emergency response, where we get as much information as we can and assess that. And I expect that will have to happen and be very public.
So can you talk a little bit then about where, and again, this is all in an emergency, decisions are being made, that have to be made, and you kind of deal with consequences afterwards. So one of the consequences that you touched on earlier is that, this is a site that the county has committed to CFH in the City of Bellevue for the siting of the new Eastside shelters, or shelter. And
Yeah.
it's actually, it's not shelters, but it is a complex.
Right.
How is this going to affect, this process, if at all?
Well, in one key way, it has already affected the process, and that is the people who work in our facilities and maintenance division at King County, who are responsible for negotiating sales of property, leases of property in both directions. We sell, we buy, we lease, are now not working on things like selling off properties for the long term. They are working on things like setting up QIR sites. So most of our folks are totally engaged with the immediate emergency response. So whatever work was happening is at a minimum slowed and at a maximum put aside until the emergency is behind us. One of the things they're doing is trying to help CFH, as I said earlier, de-intensify their shelters. They're not set up to have the people they have. And something we saw with the a couple of shelters in downtown Seattle, if they get a positive case, they have to go into lockdown. And that's not just social distancing. They have to shut the doors. Nobody new comes in. Nobody in goes out. And the staff have to agree to live there 24/7 until 2 weeks have passed without transmission within the facility, and then they can open up again. Because we are trying very, very hard not to have the virus transmit in the homeless population, because that would be another way to start off that second wave.
Do you know, so before all the stuff with the virus kind of kicked in, there was an epidemic happening with Hep A, I believe, that hadn't been controlled when this started.
Right.
Do you know where we are with that? Because that's also within the homeless population. And, you know, we've seen, not in Seattle, but in some other cities, Southern California, it's been devastating, and it spreads to the general populace.
Yeah. I have less information about the Hep A outbreak. I know it was focused around a homeless population in Ballard, and that public health was deployed and was working on responding to that, but that is something we can follow up on as well.
And honestly, it's as much while we all care about the entire population as a community, you know, again, this is really coming from Eastgate. I don't want to be limiting, you know, and saying we only care about the people here.
Right.
But, you know, that's really kind of where people want, just wanting to make sure that the county has a handle on even controlling it so that things don't move from place to place.
Thank you. Yep.
So I'm going through the questions, and you know, I think that a lot of them have been covered. The group is small enough that I think it's fine to open up to questions. Does anybody here have questions that they'd like to pose directly? There's ways that you can raise your hand. I don't know if people have the ability to unmute themselves automatically.
Yes.
If you, okay.
Yes, we do.
Okay, that's great.
You've unleashed it now, Saki.
So do you have a question, Julie?
You know, I'm very apologetic. Believe it or not, I had another Zoom meeting that was at 7, so I'm late. So I'm not sure what questions have already been asked.
Yeah.
And I
Give it a
don't
shot.
want to. Okay. Well, can you kind of just like in a 2 seconds, just kind of bring me up to speed
Well,
of
I mean,
when they're going to open? And
Yeah, I would. So,
Yeah.
so I would tell you that we don't know whether or not the sites are going to open.
Okay.
The Eastgate site is not active at the moment, and
Okay.
and a number of the other sites aren't either. We're still trying to figure out what the need is.
I see.
You know, we're in a great place, frankly, that, you know, these are problems that we don't want, but better to be prepared for. So I think that was something Claudia echoed earlier, is that in an emergency, we want to make sure that we don't get, apologize for the analogy, caught with our pants down, right? You know, we
Right.
want to be prepared. And so we are. And, you know, if we over prepared, it's not a bad thing. The question becomes, you know, what do we do now? And so all these things have been addressed. There's a lot of questions that are still unanswered.
Okay. Well, I guess one thing, and maybe this has, again, if I'm going over old territory, I apologize. But, you know, as far as, is this primarily, if we were to need it, are these tents primarily for those folks that are homeless, that have been exposed to the virus, and that are going to be in quarantine at that facility?
So yeah, that's a great question. There's three types of facilities that we've identified. These temporary facilities is isolation, quarantine, and recovery, essentially. What you described is either isolation or quarantine, somebody who's been tested or is at risk or is sick, and we're just trying to keep them apart so they don't infect people.
Correct.
This one would be a recovery site, which means these are people who have gotten COVID, have been sick with COVID, aren't urgent enough to be in a hospital, and we don't want them using up hospital beds because the people who need to be in the hospital are taking up the beds and the ventilators and that sort of thing. So it's a recovery site for people who are sick and getting well. The types of people that could be there include anybody who who has a home, who can't be in that home and be sick because maybe they live with an elder relative or something that can't risk being near them as they are recovering. Anybody who doesn't have a home either because they're traveling or because they're homeless. So any of those, and what I learned this week that's new is the way that they are selecting people to go into the sites is multiplicitous. There's no one entry site. There's no place that you must get diagnosed by X and referred by Y. That anybody who calls into the hotline and meets the criteria could, in theory, be referred. So we don't know exactly where, like in Shoreline, which is open now, and there's a small number of people there. I asked the question, where are those folks coming from? And I'm still waiting on an answer. So we don't know. It's not real clear.
That would actually also be, Claudia, I think great information to be able to share, because I think many of us who have been involved for the last few years, when I hear the explanation of who the population is, and I hear travelers and people who are experiencing homelessness, what I understand it clearly to be is people who are experiencing homelessness. And so, and that's okay. But
that's the largest group that we have, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, but if you have the information afterwards on who that population was representing in Shoreline, that would be great information. So Heidi has her hand up. Here, hang on a second. Let me mute you or unmute you.
She needs to unmute herself.
There we go. No, I got her. Heidi, you're unmuted.
Oh God! Now you've done it.
Oh, she's frozen.
And now she's frozen.
I've never seen anything like it.
That's, yeah. All right. Oh, well, we'll come back to Heidi.
Can you hear her?
Heidi never frozen.
Yeah.
No, I've never seen her silent like that. I'm kidding.
So yeah, I mean, and back to the Shoreline thing. I think that we're actually, lucky to have the Shoreline comparison, because it mirrors, what would be in Eastgate. And so that'll be valuable information however we get it.
As a follow-up, can I just ask why, I know that at CenturyLink, they made that hospital, and just as quickly as it was assembled, it was disassembled. Why that wouldn't have been an option to keep that going for these folks instead of even having a tent? It seems like the facilities would be more conducive in an actual stick-built or brick-built or whatever CenturyLink's made out of, just something more substantial than a tent. It seems like I'm kind of wondering why that, and then lastly, as far as the tents and the fact that these people aren't sick enough to be in a hospital, what does the security of that look like? If they're feeling well enough, like, hey, I'm feeling much better, I want to go out and take a walk. Is that going to be feasibly possible?
Right. Yep. So I'm trying to take down those questions. That's a series. I'm going to try to answer them all. And if I miss any, please state it again. Okay.
Okay.
So the field hospital that got set up and then dismantled without ever seeing a single patient was yet a fourth kind of thing. We talked about three kinds of things: Q, I, R, and then shelter de-intensification. The hospital was meant to be an actual hospital to cover all kinds of treatment needed in any hospital that's not COVID, to relieve the hospitals over Lake Evergreen, et cetera, from having to do things like knit broken bones, that they could take on emergency. And it was interesting. I actually got to tour it with the general and his top brass. I was so sorry to see them go because those folks, man, they are competent and they know what they're doing. And it was really reassuring to have them here at the time. I asked just a little side note, I asked the senior guy in charge, who I believe was a colonel level, where he was stationed before Seattle, and he said it was in South Sudan. So, so they're
Wow.
like, they are used to it, right? They're used to being in it. And truthfully, they're used to being in tents, just like the ones at Eastgate. That is a military grade hospital style tent. It was unusual for them to be inside a building. One of the questions that I did take on as a note to follow up on was, where's the SODO site? There is a SODO site for one of the recovery centers, and is it that exact site? And I need to follow up and make sure and find out the answer to that. It may be that we've identified that building as another potential recovery site, like Shoreline, like Eastgate. And the reason why you do them all instead of just one is because we didn't know how many numbers we were going to need. At first, we thought we were going to need 3,000 beds of all these different types of beds added together. And, you know, knock wood, cross fingers, and everybody keep washing your hands. It looks like we're not going to need that many beds, and that is a good thing. You asked about security, and so we did learn more since the last time we talked. There was not a full community discussion like this, but with a group of folks who were associated with the CFH community outreach and some other local leaders a few weeks ago. And since then, Dr. Duchin, who's our local health officer through King County Public Health, issued an order. And this is a legally binding order, like the order that tells us all that we can't be in groups of, I forget what the number is anymore, but first it was 250, then it was 50, and it was 10. That if you are in one of these sites, you cannot walk away. You have to sign an agreement. You can't walk away. You have to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, there can be enforcement. And enforcement starts with, you know, don't do that, and goes up to involuntary commitment. I mean, involuntary quarantine is one of the strongest powers that the local health officer has. So if you were Typhoid Mary and you tested sick with something and they didn't want you traveling around, and you were basically saying, screw you, I'm going to keep traveling around infecting people, they could actually lock you up. So they're leaning heavily on education and voluntary compliance right now, but that power has been mentioned and it does exist. So, and
Okay.
the question, I was asked a question that I don't still have the answer to at the last meeting: who will be providing security? And I intend to continue asking until we understand who it is. I think we need to know what types of people. Is it police? Is it a paid security firm? Is it something else?
And Claudia, these are great examples of things that will hopefully be decided before you need to have the decision made, because you're going to be in a much better position of being able to control whatever outcomes come if you know the answer to that, as opposed to having, 50 people show up on the site and then you're in a scramble position to have to provide security of some sort.
They will not open without knowing the answer to that question. And we have been promised, as I said earlier, we have been promised that we will get advance notice, maybe not a lot of advance notice, maybe just a few days, but that it's opening. And I expect that that's part of that advance notice, and not just who's providing security and how, but a contact number that the community can have in order to reach out if you need to call for some reason.
Yeah, that would be great.
You need to have that relationship.
So Heidi's back. Heidi, I'm unmuting you. So go ahead with your question.
Oh, you know what? It sounds to me, sorry, my phone hung up. It sounds to me like the question that I wanted to ask was probably what was being addressed as I got logged back on.
Sorry.
It was really about, I was concerned because I heard you talking about with the CFH shelter saying, hey, if somebody is identified as ill there, that the whole thing goes into lockdown. I thought that's great, that's responsible. But I'd been watching what was happening in Kent and that sort of thing and thinking, so why is it that one site goes into lockdown like that, but we can't keep people on site in other areas?
No, that's absolutely fair. And that, I think that we're moving very fast, right? One of the biggest issues that you all have that is a legitimate issue is, why wasn't there some level of community discussion prior to making a decision to plant these tents here And the answer is, whether it's good or not, it's the real answer is because we were moving really fast. The facilities management people in the executive branch were under the orders to go get 3,000 beds. Do it. Go now.
Yeah,
And if you ask them where they're going to be, how many of which kind where, they couldn't answer. They were too busy moving.
So hopefully
And so
in hindsight, because we talked about this at the last meeting, you'll be able to say, well, okay, so maybe these tents were necessary because now we also have all these hospital beds that we didn't have, which frankly are not hospital beds, hotel beds, that are existing structures with individual rooms, heating, and running water. So you wouldn't have had to spend, the $3 million on these tents and money could have theoretically been piped right back into the community by supporting these organizations.
Yeah, I want to say something to that, but I also want to just finish a thought in Heidi's direction. The thing that happened in Kent was absolutely an example of we weren't fully ready when we opened it. They opened that site and they had 2 people in, and the second person walked out, stole something from a store across the street and hopped a Metro bus. I mean, like the worst possible example. And it was the second guy. I mean, I wish you could have been around the office, just like we were all just, oh my God, and so, but we learned, right? And luckily, and you don't want to rely on luck, I know, luckily it was harmless. It turned out he was waiting on test results and he was not sick. But we can't have that. We don't want the worst case scenario. So they learned and they did a number of things, including making sure there will be security at each of these sites and issuing that order that Dr. Duchin issued, I talked about before, saying you must sign an agreement and you must comply with it or there will be some kind of consequences.
So,
go ahead.
No, go on.
I just wanted to say about the difference between tents and big open buildings and hard walls and soft walls and hotels. If I may bore you for just a moment with a little bit of personal history, I worked for the King County jail system for 17 years. And at one point I ran the King County jail system, and I will talk about that at length with anybody who buys me a beer when we're all able to be in a place together. But there are different styles of housing units when you house any sort of population in this kind of institutional way. And sometimes it's cells with doors with one person on a bed inside, or rooms with doors. Let's just take the jail out of it. Sometimes it's rooms with more than one person inside. Sometimes it's small open areas with bunks. Sometimes it's big open areas with bunks. And each of these operates somewhat differently. And one of the major differences is the amount of staff you need to run them. You cannot run a hotel style thing with people who are sick and the reason I bring up the jail is because those folks need watching. You can't just go on in there, good luck, we'll bring you your meals 3 times a day. You have to watch them. And sick people likewise for a different reason, because they need to be watched in case they get sicker, for treatment, for whatever. The staffing you need to go door to door to door to door versus a big open space is actually significantly different. And therefore the operations cost more. And not only cost more, they have capacity differences. So the hotel capacities, I actually wrote them down. I made a little chart for myself of these, which I will send along to you. But the capacities so the hotel capacities are like 84 beds, 23 beds, 99 beds. The tent capacities are from 140 to 240.
Well, so it's 70 per tent if we're modeling shoreline. So the Eastgate has 140 beds.
So if you're really in need, in a situation where you truly needed massive ways to house people, those sorts of big open areas serve a purpose in that you can house larger numbers of people. Anyway, I just wanted to share that logistical reality.
Claudia, since you worked with the jail population, this was another thing that I just, maybe you can answer for me. As far as them releasing upwards of 900 folks from the jails for the distancing, was there any thought given to putting these tents on prison grounds rather than just letting these folks out of the jail that maybe don't even have a place to go? I don't know.
So that is a great question. The short answer is in the Seattle area, there is no extra space around the Seattle jail. If you've ever walked around it, it's fun. Actually, walk around it someday. Look at the paints on the side. They put swatches up there. I got to pick the paint style for the jail, and then they never painted it, so the swatches still sit there. Just a little story for the memoirs. You heard it here first. in Kent, there is room, but it's within a secure perimeter, and we are not set, and it's actually not ground that you could easily lay a big tent on. So I'm thinking about our land, and yeah, it's a good question. I don't know whether they've thought about it or not, but as I think about it, none of the King County sites really would have been physically capable of holding the tents, I don't believe.
Or
So
another
Claudia,
site,
Julia,
site that,
can we hold off?
yeah.
I'm sorry. So
Sure.
it's 7:59, and I want to be
okay.
honoring of Claudia's time. So any last thoughts that you want to share, Claudia? We're very appreciative of the time, and you know, I'm going to post the recording of this so that people who weren't able to join us can see it and hear it. And Madeline's going to send me the chat box and things like that. But any last thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I want to actually, if I could go back to Julie's question just for a moment and then wrap up.
It's your time.
Julie, I do want to say that in terms of who we released, I don't know if it's really been well publicized, but they started with the least, and when I say least risk, it doesn't mean that the people are less risky, but the first big chunk of folks who were released were people who were in on what they call DOC holds. They've been released from prison, they're on parole, and they've done something to violate their parole. And those people by law get put into a 3-day hold. They come in on day 1, they go out on day 3 or 4, I forget how you count it. But so those folks were coming out just naturally in a few days anyway. And so we just decided to not do the 3 days anymore. So it was stuff like that. They really tried to prioritize folks who are going to be out and about anyway. And hopefully they're not homeless, but we don't, like, the jail doesn't actually, doesn't manage, and our system should do a better job of managing. So final comments, let me see this. I held this for the end, but I want to make a bit of a pitch to you all as community members. I think that one thing that this virus has done is shine a light on many of the ways that our systems don't really work very well. We're talking about one particular system, and that is how we engage government and community together to make decisions. And that's something that I think we know, and I think you know better than most, that we've struggled with finding a way to do that that feels authentic to the community, where you feel like you have involvement and your voices are heard, and you, even if the decision ultimately that gets made isn't the one you wanted, it was a process that was honored, and that honored your legitimate interests and involved you in a real way. I'm thinking about things like healthcare. Why do we accept that people don't have access to healthcare? You know, transportation. I already had a conversation earlier today with somebody who wanted to lobby for somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion worth of WashDOT investments in highway widening right here in the east side of King County. And I said, why would we ever do that again? Because apparently you can turn off traffic. Like, I know we can't survive economically like this, but what if all of those office-based folks and all our tech companies had a 25% telecommute rule? Everybody telecommutes at least 1 day a week. We could cut the peak off of traffic like that for free. And so I think there's lots of things like that that we as a community need to start thinking through. Let's not accept the way things were, because we've seen that they could be better. And that's just all I wanted to say at the end.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm hearing that you're advocating for universal health care.
I am. Are you
that's
okay
all
with
right,
that?
you know.
All right, let's do it.
So, Claudia, thank you again very much for the time, and I'm sure that there's going to be lots of questions, and hopefully, you know, we'll be back to whatever the normal is sooner than later. But thanks everybody for joining. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I have a list of questions, Saki, that I will write and send answers to, and we'll exchange until we get them all and
That
share
sounds
them.
great. Much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Madeline.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Be safe. Wash your hands.